6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Symposium. American.
Yeah, that's all we will know.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all we will know.
Yeah.
11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They told me to come up here and talk, so I've been reading this over and over again. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I stay up here until they tell me to stop talking. We are asking everyone's assistance with staying on schedule. Therefore, each presenter is allotted 20 minutes for their paper. Please hold all questions until the designated discussion period at the end of each section. Section. Questions and answers will be moderated by Maureen Zaremba, Curator of Education, the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art, and Alan Chong, Chief Curator, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum of Art. Please feel free to refresh your beverages during the sessions. Please turn off all cell phones. This is a microphone check for Symposium on American Gothic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Keep going? Oh. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, I can come back.
Oh, it's on here. Here's the laser.
Okay.
See.
And where's advance on that?
Let's see. For
We'll
advance,
have a chance to, you can either use, you'll have your, let's see,
I'm at the end of the morning.
you were after a break. You'll advance your
there's the
slides
keyboard. I
here.
didn't see it. Okay. All right.
And then if you want the laser pointer.
Cool.
So, and there's plenty of water here. Okay, I'm going to begin. Well, good morning. Thank you for coming out on this, again, un-Florida-like Saturday morning for this session of our symposium. We are on a very tight schedule. We have a number of absolutely fascinating presentations over the course of the day. So we have set a few ground rules that I would like to share with you all, if you haven't read them up on the screen. Each presenter is allotted 20 minutes. I am the timekeeper, and as my colleagues here will confirm, I can be ruthless if necessary. Don't make me be that way. We're asking the audience to hold questions. There are designated discussion periods at the end of each session, and those will be moderated by myself and Alan Chong. It's a long day. Please feel free to get up and refresh your beverage as needed. Please turn off all cell phones. Any questions before we begin? Then our first section is 19th century France. And to get us started is Aurélie Nidam. Aurélie, you ready?
in France. So I will. Good morning. Over the course of the 19th century in France, an important. Okay. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Over the course of the 19th century in France, an important new area of artistic interest emerged. It was visible in the mention of private collectors, in museums, and even in some architecture. Indeed, by the end of the century, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance were everywhere. I would like to explain how this new taste emerged and matured, and how collectors and museums dealt with medieval and Renaissance objects appearing on the art market. First, I would like to focus my study on the increasing interest for medieval and Renaissance art during the 19th century. Then, in a second part, I will show the influence of this interest on private collectors, and in a third part, on public museums. The 19th century was a period during which the taste for the Renaissance, and above all, the Middle Ages, grew enormously. Starting with the Romantic movement, with figures such as Victor Hugo, author of the famous novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame, this text took on several forms. The collecting of objects became one of the most common expressions of interest in this historical period. The attraction of collecting such objects was pointed out by 19th century French authors such as Edmond Beaudafé, also a collector, who said, and I quote, "Antiquity is too far from us. Its customs, lifestyles, and tools are no longer ours. Inversely, the 17th and 18th century are too close to us. We see them right in front of us in our palaces, museums, and private homes. We know their history by art. Situated between these two limits, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance close the ancient history and open the modern era. We are the children of their mind, flesh and blood. They are our direct forefather and our master." End of quote. Though each collector claimed his individual predilection for these ages, the taste for medieval and Renaissance art belonged to a global movement that expanded during the 19th century. This increasing interest is attested by the growing number of articles, books, and magazines devoted to medieval and Renaissance art. And it is important to underline the pivotal role played by some authors in this revival. Authors such as Eugène Viollet-Duc, Alexandre du Sommerard, Philippe Mauret, and Marius Vachon. Their written work allowed a better knowledge of this period. Similar research existed in England with books like Gothic Furniture of the 15th Century by Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, 1835, and Specimens of Ancient Furniture by Henry Shaw, 1836. Moreover, it was during the 19th century that the term Gothic, then Romanesque, and Renaissance were coined. This fight for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance could also be linked to increasing nationalism. Indeed, in France at this time, the Renaissance was considered to be more French than Italian, and Gothic art was an integral part of French history. Viollet-Duc even called Gothic art national art. The taste for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance also greatly influenced 19th century art with the development of two new styles, Neo-Gothic and Neo-Renaissance. The imitation of medieval art first emerged in the decorative art in 1825 and between 1825 and 1835 with the so-called cathedral styles, soon replaced by the Gothic style used in famous examples such as the Crusade Room at the Palace of Versailles, that you can see here in a painting by Prosper Lafaille, or the Boudoir of Princess Mary at the Tuileries. Neo-Gothic style was followed by Neo-Renaissance. Here you can see famous pieces of furniture by the Grouet brothers, so the cabinet at the Louvre, and by Henri-Auguste Fourdinois, the cabinet stand at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. The Neo-Gothics and Neo-Renaissance styles also encountered great success in architecture. The Saint-Clotilde Church that you can see here, built in Paris by François Christian Gault, is a very good example of this kind of construction. Private collectors who wanted to display their collection and live in a medieval atmosphere also called upon Neo-Gothic architects to build their mansions. We will now focus on private Parisian collector. Indeed, the character of the collector really stood out in the 19th century. The figures who embody this archetype in the first half of the 19th century is the cousin Pons, a character created by Balzac in one of his novels. He was inspired by actual collector, precursor who, for the very first time, amazed exclusively medieval and Renaissance objects. This include Charles Sauvageot, Edmond Durand, and Pierre Rivol, whose collections are now in large part at the Louvre, as well as other interesting collectors such as Alexandre du Sommerard and the Prince Pierre de Soltikoff. I now would like to focus on two particular collectors who perfectly incarnate the character and variety of collecting in the second half of the 19th century, Frédéric Spitzer and Émile Gaillard. Frédéric Spitzer, was born in Vienna in 1815 to a poor Jewish family. He decided to become an art dealer, at first in Germany, England, Belgium, and in the Netherlands. By 1852, once he had made his fortune, he established himself in Paris, where he devoted his life to two activities, art dealing and collecting for himself. His collection is well known thanks to a catalogue raisonné published in 6 volumes between 1890 and 1892. It included 3,369 objects, mostly for the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and 508 arms and armor. The ivory and metalwork were famous for their quantity and quality. Here you can see some objects from his collection. There were also numerous pieces of Italian maiolica, tapestries, and wooden furniture. All these objects were displayed in his mansion located on Rue de Villejuste in Paris. So here you can see the arms and armor room, the Italian art room, and the study. Though decoration and symmetrical display were very important to Spitzer, there was a real wish to classify his objects. Spitzer insisted on the importance of his collection as an educational tool, and it was visited by a great number of guests, including aristocrats, politicians, artists, and other art lovers. Though they had something in common, Émile Gaillard was a different kind of collector. He was born in Grenoble, in France, in 1821 to a famous and wealthy family of bankers. He himself became a banker in Paris, where he acted as financial advisor to famous figures such as the Count of Chambord. In 1878, he hired the architect Victor Jules Février to build a Renaissance-style castle in Paris for him and his family. This Château Gaillard, as it was called, also provides an appropriate setting for his collection, comprised mostly of decorative art objects such as these pieces of furniture, so a dresser, as you can see here, fireplaces, and maiolica. Here you can see some examples from Faenza, so the dish and the entombment. The collection was displayed in every room of the mansion, including the dining room, the living room, and the reception room. But this object functioned more as state props for his mansion than as any real study on the history of art. Indeed, his collection was not open to the public, and no catalogue raisonné was ever published. His collection was more a reflection of a general taste for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which Gaia wanted to revive, not only through this object, but also by organizing fancy costume balls, like the famous ball of 1885. So here you can see a drawing from his ball published in a contemporary newspaper. These two examples allow us to see that there were very different kinds of collectors during the 19th century. Their collection had different goals, being a part of a setting for Gaia or being a real aid to understanding the history of art for Spitzer. Some even called the Spitzer Mansion the Spitzer Museum. And after Spitzer's death, several intellectuals like Émile Molinier tried to convince the French government to buy the collection and the mansion in order to create a museum. But this collection was sold in block during a famous and impressive sale and was then dispersed. Most of the pieces were bought by American collectors or by European decorators and dealers who eventually sold them to American collectors. This object enriched the collection of wealthy American families who used them to decorate their interior of their imposing mansion in New York or Newport, recreating what they used to call their Gothic room. But some of these objects were also bought by French museums like the Louvre, whose curator put forward the same educational goal promoted by Spitzer. Indeed, during the 19th century, public museums opened in Paris, showing the same kind of medieval and Renaissance objects. The most important and interesting was the Museum of French Monuments, created in Paris in 1795, thanks to the determination of one man, Alexandre Lenoir, whom you can see here, painted by Marie Bouliard. Founded in the former monastery of the Petits Augustins, it hosts the royal tombs from Saint-Denis, as well as objects confiscated from the religious order during the French Revolution. This is the Gothic room here. The goal of Lenoir was to illustrate each period with work of art. He even went so far to manufacture fake monuments to support his theory of the history of style, like the tomb of Abelard, composed of several medieval fragments. In spite of these questionable acts, Lenoir and the Museum of French Monuments greatly influenced the emerging taste for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, in particular because of the atmospheres created in each room of the museum. The tombs were sent back to the Abbey of Saint-Denis when the museum closed in 1816. But in 1832, the son of Lenoir persuaded the French state to buy the Cluny Mansion in Paris to create a museum with sculpture from Parisian churches, in addition to the medieval collection of Alexandre du Sommerard. This medieval mansion, with its flamboyant Gothic chapel, was a perfect setting from this object. In 1844, the opening of this museum, which still exists today, was a real success. These museums, and I could also name the Louvre, illustrate the general interest for medieval art and Renaissance art, not only by the state, but also by the people who enjoyed strolling through the galleries. Ignored for a long time, this kind of objects were suddenly brought to light. In conclusion, we can see that it was during the 19th century that the taste for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance really came into being and touched every part of the society, private collectors, museums, and even contemporary artistic production. Indeed, people lived in Gothic interior and saw Gothic-style building, new or totally medieval, everywhere. Therein the ambivalence of this period. There was an equal interest for the real object and the imitation, and no distinction made between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Atmosphere prevailed over everything. Later on, the interest of collector would be more specific and research on this period more precise. But France was not an isolated case. The same phenomenon existed in other countries, as we will see with interest during this symposium. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning. First of all, I beg your pardon for my bad English accent, so be indulgent with me. Thank you. Well, I can speak about the relations of Émile Molinier with collectors without saying who he was. He was born in 1857. He was a student at the École des Chartes in Paris between 1875 and 1878. And 1 year later, he was engaged by the Musée du Louvre as an assistant in the Département de la Sculpture et des Objets d'Art, which is a sculpture and decorative arts department. He became an assistant curator 13 years later in 1892, and in 1893, so the next year, he became the curator of the Decorative Arts Department, which was created at this date. So there is a separation between sculpture and decorative art at this moment. And the sculpture department is headed by Louis Courageau. Émile Molinier was a great worker. He wrote a lot of articles and books. He was a teacher at the École du Louvre, with a new pedagogical concession, because he used to take his students in the rooms of the museum to teach the history of art with the works of art themselves. So you can see there a plaster of a medal made in memory of Émile Molinier, and in the back room, so you have his profile, and in the back room, you can see the titles of his principal publications, like Histoire générale des arts appliqués, Les plaquettes, De la Robia, etc. So he published a lot of books. Furthermore, Molinier made important changes in the rooms of the Département des Objets d'Art, especially in the Renaissance rooms. You can see one of these Renaissance rooms, that he changed a lot. And he made a lot of new acquisitions for the museum. And most of all, he was quite in advance in his time, because he created new rooms in the Louvre dedicated to the decorative arts of the 18th century. So you can see 2 pictures of these new rooms opened in 1901. In one word, Émile Molinier seemed to have had a perfect career. In fact, the reality is completely different, because Émile Molinier resigned from the Louvre in March 1992, and he was only 45 years old at this moment. And 1 year before he resigned, he sent a letter to the Marquise Arconati Visconti, in which he writes that, so here is the letter, and he writes, pour le temps que j'ai à rester dans cette porcherie qu'on nomme l'administration, that means that the French administration is a pigsty. So it's quite hard. And in fact, he could have made a very nice career. And certainly, he could have become the director of the National Museums, who was at this time also the director of the Louvre, if he had had a better tempered character. After his resignation, Émile Molinier became an art dealer, but he died 4 years later in 1906, and his collection has been sold after his death. So you can see the first page of the sale catalog. And so in the catalog there are 679 lots, so it's a quite big collection, but not very important. And we can note that the sculpture department of the Louvre bought 3 pieces at the sale. So I show you this sculpture of Saint Sebastian, a French sculpture, and 2 medallions from the castle of Villeneuve de Poitou. But the decorative arts department bought nothing at the sale, maybe because they were not very happy with Molinier and what happened with him. And so the decorative art bought nothing, even if some objects were of high quality. Like I show you this ivory, which was in the Émile Molinier's collection, and well, it happened to get in the Louvre collection, but only in 1995, as you can see on the slide. Furthermore, before his days, when Molinier was installed as an art dealer, he had acted once as a middleman for the Louvre in 1905, when he bought a large early Italian Maiolica vase at the late Michel Bois' sale. So he bought the vase and then he sold it to the Louvre for 2,250 francs. But the problem is that I don't know at which price Molinier bought the piece at the sale, so I don't know if he made any profit on this transaction. Well, it was not unusual at this time that a curator became a collector. And for example, Willem Froner, that you see here, he was a former curator of antiquities of the Louvre, and he became a great collector after he left the museum in 1870. Anyway, it was not unusual. In fact, a lot of the 19th century curators were also collectors. And for example, well, I could give a lot of examples, but I can mention Frédéric Rézé. He was curator of the drawings of the Louvre from 1850, and then he became curator of the paintings and the drawings from 1861. And he was a very important collector, and he sold his collection of 380 drawings to the Duc d'Aumale for 140,000 francs in 1860. So he was a curator, and at the same time he was selling drawings. And he also gave 2 plates of Urbino Maiolica in 1852 to the Louvre. And by the way, Molinier began his collection before he resigned from the Louvre, and he made from time to time some donations to the Louvre. And well, you can see some of the objects he gave to the Louvre when he was an assistant, and then assistant curator, and then curator. So there are a lot of them. And well, in fact, Émile Molinier seems to be quite different from the other curators by the number of collection catalogues that he wrote during his life. And one catalogue played a special part in his life. I will speak about that later. And in fact, Molinier made 2 sorts of collection catalogues. Well, catalogues raisonnés and sale catalogues. So you can see here the list of his catalogues raisonnés. There are 6, you can see. And well, first of all, there is the Yaves collection catalogue that you now all know. And well, those catalogues are in fact very different in purpose and in size. And the most important is, of course, the Spitzer's catalogues. Well, Aurélie did speak about it already, and I will speak about these catalogues later. And here is a list of sale catalogs made by Molinier. So, except the catalog of the Spitzer collection sale, of which he made only the preface, I think, the sale catalogs he made were written after Molinier resigned from the Louvre. So he was really acting as an art dealer, and it seems quite normal that he made so many sale catalogs at this moment. And in some case, like the Bois sale, he also bought pieces of the sale. Molinier published the Gavet, Spitzer, and Wallace collection catalogs when he was still a curator at the Louvre, although the Wallace catalog was published after he resigned. So the question is it normal for a curator to write the catalogues raisonnés of a private collection? Well, I can give a first answer. Molinier was not the only one to act like this. And for example, Alfred Darcel, who was curator at the Ringling Museum, published the catalogue of the Basilevsky's collection in 1874. So you can see the first page, the title page of this catalogue. Furthermore, this kind of collection catalogues is very close to other kind of publications that were very usual at this time. I mean, articles written by curators or specialists on private collections and published in some reviews like the Gazette des Beaux-Arts. So here you can see, for example, two articles written by Émile Molinier on Bonafé and Heiner's collections. Here is an article also by Molinier on the Spitzer's collection, written in 1889. Those articles about a private collection were written in the purpose of a better publicity of the different private collections. Maybe sometimes with the purpose to get donations for the museums. And the catalogues raisonnés were certainly considered also as a way to publicize some private collections. Everybody seems to agree about that, even in the case of the catalogue of the Spitzer's collection, written under the direction of Émile Molinier. Indeed, Alfred de Lostalot published an article in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1890 about the catalogue, and he wrote that Molinier, you can see here in the green box, so he wrote that Molinier was a perfect man to write the catalogue because he was young, so not too busy, and as you know, but he was young but a good scientist. But in fact, it was not so evident for Molinier to write the Spitzer's collection catalogue. Molinier had to write to Alfred de Campan, the director of the National Museum, who was, as I already said, also the director of the Louvre. So he had to write a long letter in November 1887 to explain why he should accept to write this catalogue. This letter shows that it was not so obvious that a curator from the Louvre should accept to write this catalogue. And it was not so obvious that a curator from the Louvre could work for a private collector. As Molinier writes himself in this letter, the writing of this catalogue meant that the French state put a civil servant at the service of a private collection. And this letter is mentioned by Alan Chong in his essay in the catalogue of the exhibition, but I found new documents bearing evidence that Molinier played a double role because he wrote the letter that we've just seen. When he wrote the letter we've just seen, Molinier had already agreed to write the catalogue. But 1 year before he wrote to the director, he had already accepted to do the catalogue. So you see here in a letter in August 1886, Molinier sent a letter to Frederick Spitzer to tell him that he accepted to write entries for the catalogue. And another new document points out that relations between Molinier and Spitzer have been somehow difficult. In June 1888, Molinier wrote to Spitzer that he is so tired that he is not anymore sure to be able to finish his work for the catalogue. And he added that he saw some objections to keep on working on it. And here, well, it's hard to read it, but in fact, Molinier accused Spitzer of making him working like a laborer. And Molinier threatened to stop working on the catalogue. So it was quite difficult relations between Spitzer and Molinier. But in the end, Molinier and Spitzer seemed to have get an agreement because the first volume of the catalogue was published in 1890. The year Spitzer died, so the poor man didn't see the end of the catalogue of the publication, and the other volumes were published till 1892. At this moment begins the second part of what I call the Spitzer problem for Molinier, with the sale of the collection. So this sale was a crucial moment for Molinier's career. The sale of the Spitzer's collection took place 3 years after the collector's death, in April and May 1893. It was a big event for the art world and was described as the sale of the century. Molinier had written the foreword of the sale catalogue, as I already said. At this date, he had been appointed as an assistant curator a few months ago, and Louis Courageau is the other assistant curator of the department, and Edmond Saglio is the curator of the department. But as Molinier had been participating to the catalogue of the Spitzer collection, the museum administration asked him, and not Saglio, to choose the pieces of the collection that the Louvre Museum and the Cluny Museum had to buy. So he made an official report with the list of objects that should be bought for both museums. There were bronzes, ivories, enamels, Palissy earthenware, marble and terracotta sculptures, maiolica. During the sale, Edmond Saglio, so Molinier's boss, was bidding for the objects that the Louvre wanted. But 2 times, Molinier also bid for the Louvre, and the newspaper attacked Molinier afterwards. They accused him to increase the prices of the objects by bidding himself during the sale, and they accused him to be on both sides, on the side of the vendor, because he had participated to the catalogue, and on the side of the buyer, because he was working for the Louvre. And all the newspapers are especially critical about the acquisition of a bronze. So here you can see the page, one page of the sale catalogue of bronzes from the Spitzer collection. And in this sale, there were two bronzes that you can see in green boxes. Two busts, one of a young man and one of an old woman. And in his report, Molinier had asked the acquisition of the masculine bust for the price of 20,000 francs. The day when the 2 bronzes were sold, Edmond Saglio bidded for the bust, but stopped when the price reached 40,000 francs. And at this moment, Molinier, who was sitting next to the director of the National Museums, asked him the permission to keep on the bid. And the director agreed, and Molinier had the bronze sculpture for 41,000 francs. But immediately after, the second bust was sold, only for 20,000 francs to the collector Nelly André. So the newspaper accused Molinier to buy pieces for twice the normal price and to waste public money. Even Louis Gons, who was the editor of the Gazette des Beaux-Arts and had been working a lot with Molinier, thinks that Molinier had been acting badly. In a letter written at this moment, Louis Gons writes, « J'ai constaté l'incompatibilité qui paraissait exister entre les fonctions de conservateur agissant comme représentant d'un musée et le même conservateur participant à la rédaction et à la préparation d'une vente. Well, I know the incompatibility between the functions of curator acting for his museum and the same curator acting for a sale. Molinier tried to justify what happened and said that the first bust bought by the Louvre was of higher quality and better state than the second one. He also argued that the fact he was present to the action prevented some collectors to bid on the pieces wanted by the Louvre. Otherwise, the masculine bust could have reached the price of 60,000 francs. In fact, we can explain this quite violent controversy by several ways, some of them not very nice. First of all, the way the national museums made their acquisitions at this moment was quite problematic. And what is interesting is that 2 years later, after the Spitzer's collection sale, this system was reformed by a French state. We can also guess that Louis Courageau played also a role in this scandal because he was not present at the sale, and maybe he suggested to some newspaper that he should have been a better bidder than Molinier, well, as it's written in this article. So you have the name of Louis Courageau and the name of Émilie Molinier, and the article said that Louis Courageau was a better bidder for this sale. And finally, for some newspaper, the link with anti-Semitism seems strong. They accused the French state of giving money to the Jews, as well, Spitzer was a Jewish, and Molinier is seen as a middleman between the state and the Jewish collectors. Well, you have to remember that anti-Semitism was quite common in France at this moment. It was 1 year before the beginning of the Dreyfus affair. And for example, an article published, like you can see here, so an article published in the newspaper L'Autorité says, on sait que depuis un demi-siècle, les Juifs ont accaparé le monopole du bric-à-brac. Ce Spitzer appartenait à cette catégorie de collectionneurs, pour mieux dire de spéculateurs. Well, we know that for the last 50 years, the Jewish have been monopolizing the art market. This Spitzer was belonging to this kind of collectors, or better said, speculators. Well, I'm quoting the article. Now we have to try to forget this polemic and try to appreciate the acquisitions made by Molinier at the Spitzer's collection sale. For example, the most expensive acquisition is a piece of ivory. It's a fragment of a saddle, which was bought for 85,000 francs. This piece was considered by Molinier as an exceptional piece, but now it is considered as probably a fake of the 19th century. Wow. In the field of sculpture, Molinier bought an altarpiece attributed to Andrea della Robbia, coming from the Italian city of Città di Castello. Molinier thought that the piece was in good state of conservation. So you can see the piece. And a recent study of the altarpiece shows that, in fact, this piece had been widely restored. So you can see on the slide, the blue parts are original, and the orange parts are restoration, and probably 19th century restoration. So you see, it's not. It was not really in a good state of conservation. And in the same time, the Louvre did not buy the sculpture masterpiece of the sale, the monument commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara for his villa of Sassuolo. And during the Spitzer's collection sale, another important person for Molinier appeared. It's the Marquise Arconati Visconti. She participated indeed in the acquisition of an object for the Louvre. Molinier wanted to buy for the museum a medieval chalice coming from Sevilla in Spain. The highest price that the Louvre intended to pay for it was 30,000 francs. And when the bids reached this price, Edmond Saglio stopped bidding. But Molinier was sitting next to the Marquise and asked her if she would accept to keep on bidding for the Louvre. She accepted, and the piece was sold for 41,000 francs. And so the Louvre had to pay 30,000 francs, and the Marquise was paying the rest. So who is this Marquise Arconati Visconti? It's a very romantic story of a poor girl marrying the charming prince. She was the daughter of a left-wing deputy without money, and she was very interested in history and art history. She met at the École des Chartes the Marquis Arconati Visconti and married him in 1879, but he died very quickly, so she had all the money. And she spent her money to help museums and universities. She was really very generous. And she was also a great collector. And Molinier was the advisor for her acquisition. They were going at sales together. This kind of relationship between a curator and a private collector would be forbidden today in France, but it was quite usual at this moment. And Molinier was not the only one to act as an advisor for collectors. And for example, Louis Courageau was acting the same way with Nelly André, whose collection and her husband's collection are the origin of the Musée Jacques Marandré in Paris. Molinier is willingly acting as an advisor for the Marquise Arconati Visconti because he knew that she intended to give her collection to the Louvre, and she did it in 1916. Even if this kind of relation between a curator and a collector was once again quite usual at this time, it seems quite dangerous to us today. And for instance, in 1892, Molinier wanted to buy for the Louvre a harp in ivory because he thought that it was an exceptional 15th century piece. But the Louvre did not have enough money at this time to buy it, so he arranged it with the Marquise that she bought the object and gave it to the Louvre. Unfortunately, the piece was not so exceptional and is considered today as a fake. So, well, Molinier was not so good. Furthermore, the relationship between Molinier and the Marquise is another element to the question of anti-Semitism. Indeed, the Marquise had been one of the great defendants of Alfred Dreyfus, and Émile Molinier's brother, Auguste, had been a witness during the trial in favor of Dreyfus. So Molinier was considered by the anti-Dreyfusards as a friend of the Jews and also as an enemy. To conclude, the relations between Émile Molinier and the collectors were not so exceptional and unusual for this time. But Molinier was bad-tempered and was not very diplomatic. His relations with Peter and with the Marquise, along with other Jewish collectors as Isaac de Camondo and the Rothschild family, made of him a target for the anti-Semitic people. And in 1906, when he died, some of them did not forget to recall his role at the Spider sale 13 years after. Thank you.
Davies, who has managed to get here even with the best efforts of the education department not to get him from the airport last night. Private joke, we're sorry.
Okay, so can everybody hear me? Good. In 1884, Émile Molinier, curator at the Louvre and author of several catalogues of private Parisian collections, as we've just heard, was asked to provide the introduction to a lavish 2-volume publication celebrating the gargantuan exhibition of historical metalwork that had taken place in Budapest that year. Molinier singled out for special praise, and here I quote, "An innovation, a vitrine of pieces that have been recognized after careful examination as fakes, completes this brilliant ensemble. If more than one collector has seen his illusions evaporate and has been cruelly struck in his badly placed affections, then what a lesson for the future." Well, the presence of faked objects in even the greatest of collections was, to some extent, the elephant in the room of 19th century art history. Molinier's acknowledgement of the problem is a rare discussion of the subject. Significant strides to actually identify and eliminate the problem of faked objects were only taken in the early years of the 20th century, with the series of highly confidential printed acts of the Museumverband, the Federation of Museum Representatives Against Fakes. An image you've already seen today. Among all the arts acquired by 19th century collectors, metalwork, along with furniture, perhaps presented the most fertile area for fakery. By their very nature, soft silver and copperwork tend to get damaged over the years, and metal objects have traditionally been the subjects of numerous restorations. And the slide from over-restoration to downright forgery is a gentle one. And we now know that many 19th century goldsmiths actually went down this road. The attitudes of collectors, I think, contributed to this. Among the collectors who owned medieval and Renaissance metalwork during the 19th century, there were few for whom it was a consuming passion. In most collections of the period, metalwork objects played a subordinate role to paintings, bronzes, and other representations of the major arts. In photographs of collectors' interiors, the metalwork objects are usually used to help evoke the idea of the medieval and Renaissance past, but do not in themselves take centre stage. And in that sense, the image that I'm showing you here, the goldsmith's room from the Spitzer collection, is quite unusual in that sense. Unscrupulous goldsmiths and dealers were thus in a perfect position to exploit the lack of knowledge of their patrons, and indeed also respond to their need for objects suitable as furnishings for historicising interiors. Now, of course, as a writer of catalogues for a number of private collectors, including Gavet, Molinier was intimately familiar with many problematic objects, and as we shall see, there are a number of ambiguities in his writings and attitudes. And it's these ambiguities that I'd like to explore today. The Gavet collection contains many pieces that are 19th century or only partly medieval. And as such, I think it forms an interesting test case for examining attitudes to authenticity on the part of both collectors, dealers, and museum experts. But I should perhaps begin with an example of outright forgery taken from the V&A's collections. So, in other words, the making of objects with the specific intention to deceive. This chessboard was bought by the South Kensington Museum, now, of course, the V&A, from Louis Massy, a Parisian dealer, in 1895, and it was described as a medieval Limoges enamel chessboard. Marcy was a trusted friend of the museum, and for a period in the 1890s was sometimes in daily contact with curators there. Today, we know that almost all the objects sold to museums around the world by Marcy were forgeries. Marcy's real name, by the way, was Luigi Parmigiani. A lot about his life wasn't what it seemed to be. But his methods were quite subtle. When he first made contact with the South Kensington curators in 1894, it was to sell a group of quite genuine medieval textiles. And it was only after that he began offering more dubious wares. I think the tastes to which Marcy catered are quite revealing. The preponderance of the objects that he offered for sale were secular, or were perfectly adapted to the needs of modern collectors' displays. Objects like chessboards, reading lecterns, and bust reliquaries were typical of the sorts of items that his workshop or workshops were faking. And recent work by Marion Campbell has also convincingly demonstrated that the goldsmiths responsible were, for the most part, unaware of actual medieval objects. Instead, they seem to have relied on prints and published photographs of genuine pieces to use those as models for their own inventions. Well, the Gavet collection of metalwork contains many of the same types of objects that Marcy's organisation was faking. But, in fact, few, if any, pieces of the metalwork in the Gavet collection can be shown to be outright forgeries in the sense of pieces deliberately produced from scratch in order to deceive. Rather, they inhabit a more ambiguous area between restoration, alteration, and modern copy. Well, a number of 19th century collectors are known to have had their metalwork pieces restored, altered, and improved, shall we say. And the chalice that I'm showing you on the screen is one example of that. It was made in the 14th century for Florence Cathedral by the Florentine goldsmith Andrea Arditi. And it was well known in the 19th century, having formed part of two of the most famous collections of the age. Firstly, the de Bruges du Mesnil collection, and latterly, the collection of Frederick Spitzer, who I think is going to become a very well-known person to us today. The chalice today is held by the Kremlin Museum in Moscow, and early engravings, as on the left here, show that in the mid-19th century, the chalice's lower stem comprised of two parts, giving it a very vertical profile. Yet, by the time the chalice was sold from the Spitzer collection in 1893, and that's the image on the right, this had been altered to give a more balanced profile, typical of other chalices produced in the 14th century. And it was probably whilst it was in Spitzer's collection that this happened. Spitzer is known to another example of the kinds of changes that Spitzer was making to his metalwork pieces is the celebrated example of the 6 Aldobrandini tazzas that also appeared in the 1893 sale. These silver gilt objects had come to Spitzer in 1861 with very simple fluted bases, as in the example that I'm showing you on the left, that still retains that design. But Spitzer, with his preference for more elaborate decoration, substituted 6 different bases, as in the Viennese example on the right-hand side. These bases were not new. They were 16th century objects that were bolted on. Well, the combination of original elements with parts of other authentic pieces, or with completely new parts, is also a feature of the Gavet collection. In the simplest of cases, as with this Sienese chalice, an applied heraldic plaque on the base is clearly modern, and the enamels of the stem may also have been restored. The addition of a coat of arms to an object like this would certainly have increased its saleability. Among the many works faked by Marcy, for example, coats of arms were often very prominent, evoking as they did the world of late medieval nobility and piety. Other objects are more complex. This reliquary casket appears at first sight to be a typical Limoges product of the late 12th or early 13th centuries. But close examination suggests otherwise. The wooden core is clearly modern. And the plaques on the front are suspicious. Although the heads in relief of the figures are convincing enough, the blue enamel is too translucent. Has this then been re-enameled? Well, probably not, because there are other odd features. The borders of the two panels don't match. The three kings are crowned in one scene and then not in the next. The letters R-E in the upper scene are meaningless. And the engraving of the figures is very summary and really unconvincingly medieval, it seems to me. There are two glaring problems with the iconography as well. First of all, the kings are represented in both upper and lower scenes as if they are hawking. Now, this seems to link it to the kinds of birds that can be found on secular caskets with love themes, such as this very well-known example, of which has been on display in the British Museum since 1859. Their appearance on the Ringling casket is puzzling and doesn't seem to fit the composition. It's almost as if the birds have been added from another composition entirely. Finally, the Ringling casket seems to be telling the story of the three kings, or magi. Normally, such caskets, like the one on in the British Museum on the right-hand side, feature the journey of the magi along the smaller top scene and their adoration of the Christ child in the lower, larger scene. But on the Ringling casket, this order has been reversed, and the upper scene depicts the Magi before a ruler, probably intended to represent Herod. All of this evidence, I think, means that we can be quite confident in saying that the front of the casket and the wooden core are 19th century in origin. But these issues are much less pronounced when we consider the back of the casket. So was then the Ringling chasse perhaps an assemblage of pieces, some of them authentic, some of them not, intended to appeal to a collector interested in owning works that gave a flavour of medieval noble life? Gavet probably acquired this piece in its current state. But in other cases, Gavet himself can be shown to have been involved in the alteration of metalwork in his collection. The monstrance on the left here, according to Molinier, came to Gavet from the Bouvier collection, a group of objects that had been sold in Paris in December 1873. Gavet acquired a number of objects at the sale. However, the monstrance is not really a close match to any of the pieces described in the Bouvier catalogue. The closest match is to a monstrance described as having been 42 centimetres high, and the present Ringling monstrance is about half as tall again. When we start to examine this monstrance, along with the other one at the Ringling, it becomes clear that both of them have been substantially altered or restored in the 19th century, apparently by the same goldsmith. Most obviously, the figures of the Virgin and Child and a bishop to either side of the glass vessel on both pieces are identical. The glass tubes seem to be modern, and in the case of the piece on the left, the proportions really are all wrong. The foot is far too small, and the stem doesn't seem to match. And these alterations were clearly carried out under Gavet's orders. In these two pieces, restoration has been carried so far that there is little left that is wholly original. But Gavet was not always so radical. Some of the works in his collection had in fact been rather more discreetly restored. Both the reliquary bust and the ciborium in the collection, two of the nicest pieces to my eye, have applied silver rosettes on them that appear to be identical. It's possible that they've been inspired by the rosette decoration on the knop in the centre of the stem on the ciborium, which takes the same form. In these cases, the additions seem to cover up flaws in the pieces. On the ciborium, there was probably a closure of some sort, piercing the metal at these points. The holes have been covered up with the new applied decoration. The reliquary bust would originally have had a chain linking the false gems along the figure's chest, and again the applied rosettes cover up the holes left by the fixings for this lost element. The same fixings, by the way, can be seen on the back of one of the paxes in the collection as well. Now, these elements all seem to represent fairly discrete restoration works by a goldsmith working for Gavet. And certainly there were a number of goldsmiths working in Paris who were well qualified to carry out such work. Perhaps the most well-known was Alfred André, who both restored historic pieces and produced historicizing works in medieval and Renaissance styles for collectors like Spitzer and Rothschilds. One goldsmith whose historicizing work bears some similarities to the monstrances and the ciborium that we've been looking at was a man called Franz Hellner of Kempen on the Rhine. Hellner doesn't seem to have been a faker. Most of the pieces that he made, like the one I'm showing you here, are clearly marked with his name. But the problem, of course, with the most capable historicizing works was that they could easily become confused with the real thing. And the Ringling candlesticks provide a very striking example. They're exact copies, both of each other, and of a candlestick that belonged to Spitzer, and which is now in the Germanisches Museum in Nuremberg. Like other pieces in Gavet's collection, these came from the Bouvier collection at Amiens, sold in 1873. And a number of other partial copies of this candlestick design survive, and actually have been long known to scholars. I'm showing you on the left a candlestick in the Wallace collection in London. Other versions could be found in the 19th century in the collection of Johann Paul in Hamburg and the Milani collection in Frankfurt. And it's long been presumed that the Spitzer candlestick in Nuremberg was the ultimate source for all of these candlestick bases. And it was said that these copies, originating in the 1850s or 1860s, with a series of sometimes extremely unconvincing upper parts, demonstrated that their makers did not know the whole of the Spitzer candlestick, only its base. Well, I think the discovery of the Ringling candlesticks disproves this hypothesis, because they duplicate the whole of the Spitzer candlestick, differing only in that they have a pattern of enamel around the drip pans. However, the big news for today, and this is where I'm going to be instructing all of you who've invested in a catalogue to strike out elements of my catalogue entry for these objects, is that the Germanisches Museum in Nuremberg have recently decided that the Spitzer candlestick in their collection is also 19th century in origin. So, in other words, all of these candlesticks are free variants, which were presumably offered by the manufacturer for sale in different combinations, and you could choose which version you wanted. Well, you laugh, but the literature always describes these objects as fakes. And the presumption is they were intended to deceive. Molinier, for his part, catalogued the Ringling candlesticks as 13th century in origin, so he thought that they were medieval. But research for this exhibition has demonstrated that the candlesticks, like much of the other metalwork in Gavet's collection, came from the Bouvier collection at Amiens. And when they were sold from that collection, it was made very clear that they were modern imitations in a historicizing style. So these had originally been purchased as modern copies. Such candlesticks answered a need on the part of collectors. Genuine medieval works never or almost never survive as matching pairs. But with modern pastiches, one could produce a very pleasing symmetry in the presentation of caskets, reliquaries, and other items in one's collection. And Gavet certainly used his pair in this way, as on the right, and we can also see Johann Paul doing the same thing there on the left-hand side with his candlesticks in Hamburg. What's unusual is that in every known case of these historicizing candlesticks, they very quickly went from being presented as modern pastiches to being important survivals of genuine medieval bronze work. And the role of the experts who prepared sale and collection catalogues, such as the curator Molinier, is surely called into question by this phenomenon. As one of the contributors to the vast catalogue that we've been hearing about of the Spitzer collection, Molyneux can certainly be shown to have been well aware of the contents of the Spitzer collection itself, and therefore certainly knew the candlestick there. He was also well aware that a number of items in the Gavet collection came from the Bouvier sale of 1873, and mentions this in individual catalogue entries in his Gavet book, but he does not mention the Bouvier provenance of these candlesticks, effectively hiding their modern origin. And it remains a moot point, I think, whether this was down to Molyneux's direct involvement in a cover-up, or Gavet's conveniently forgetting to tell him. But the fact remains that Molyneux should have had the skills and the knowledge to spot these two candlesticks and other pieces in the collection for what they were. Now, in his fascinating catalogue essay for this exhibition, Alan Chong gives Molyneux the benefit of the doubt. Well, I think there's certainly reasons for doing this, suggesting that he may not have been aware of the Bouvier provenance of the candlesticks. But I would like to play devil's advocate and suggest that the real explanation for Molyneux's silence on this, as on all the other doubtful parts of the metalwork in the Gavet collection, comes from a somewhat different attitude to the idea of authenticity in a historical object, particularly one that would fulfill a decorative function in a collector's interior. Far from discouraging the copying of historical metalwork, many 19th century curators, Molyneux included, actively encouraged it. As we have seen, their well-illustrated publications were used as source material by fakers, and Molyneux even published a book of drawings of historical metalwork to be used as design sources by modern manufacturers. And that's this book here. In this book, The Arts of Metal, an album comprising 200 engravings, Molyneux urged modern metalworkers to study the work of the past, which were, according to him, still numerous today and well worthy of our admiration. Well, to conclude, the efforts of curators to improve modern manufactures thus combined with their reticence to publicly denounce works as fakes, and also their willingness to produce catalogues of private collections prior to their being offered for sale. All of these factors come together to produce what you might call a perfect storm, an environment in which the production and circulation of fakes would become endemic in the art market. In Molyneux's own words, what a lesson for the future. Thank you.
Art historians are accused of being dull. I mean, really.
What? What do you mean? So, yeah, you can hear me. So, a salutary lesson of this symposium for me, showing you this image again, I'm sorry, has been the demonstration of the, if you like, seductive influence of the seamless interiors presenting Émile Gavet's collection. And they seem to sweep away uncertainties about the authenticity of the early furniture contained therein. Faced with the complete entity offered by Gavet's rooms in 1889, combined with the imprimatur of Mr. Molyneux, the status of the furniture no doubt remained unquestioned for the Vanderbilts and their decorators, and one presumes that authenticity was significant here, even considering suggestions that considerations over certain kinds of objects may have been secondary in obtaining the whole. But in any case, as we always see here, you need furniture on which to put Italian Renaissance sculpture. In her entries on the Gavet furniture, Agnes has elegantly and very fairly, I think, exposed the faults with each object, from the cobbling together of the pair of dressers composed of mostly 16th century reliefs with later supports on the left-hand side depicting scenes from the Passion of Christ with Hercules and probably on the sides, and on the right what's effectively a 19th century reproduction of a 15th century chest with deeply carved foliate panels with figures within. This recognition, detailed dissection and description of these problems is crucial for us in understanding examples of early French furniture as we sift through the various possibilities for defining these objects, and we're thinking about largely original pieces that contain original parts, something that's an honest restoration, something that's composed with old parts that's dishonest, then we need to keep talking about that. The genres of remade, reinvented, and fake medieval or Renaissance furniture suggest a complexity of extensive connections between prolific networks of craftsmen working with and for dealers throughout the 19th century in creating such works, to an extent that one can hardly imagine how it really worked. Recent studies have flagged the exponential growth of dealers of antiques and curiosities in England before 1840, matched, one surmises, by counterparts on the continent, who assisted in the provision of furnishings or the carved materials to put together such things, especially from ecclesiastical sources. Complicating this picture, a number of English dealers seem to have been skilled cabinet makers as well. The true nature of the commercial interactions between restorer, dealer, and collector remain obscure, and frustratingly so, given the significance of such figures within the cultural landscape of the period. In presenting this talk, I can't offer to greatly elucidate the matter, for the persons involved in the creation of the object in question are elusive. But the case study that I will relate, which is still something of a work in progress, is a history of making and unmaking that offers some perspectives on the interests possibly driving the production of questionable pieces of early French furniture around the middle of the 19th century, and their consumption during this period, while its later reception allows us to consider somewhat the deployment of these items within the medieval galleries of American museums. At the heart of this inquiry is a collector who possesses certain similarities to Gavet in his collecting interests and for the significance the acquisition of what he had owned had for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in the same way that the Gavet-Vanderbilt holdings had somewhat of a transformational effect on the nascent Ringling Museum. This was Edmond Fouque, who was born in Nîmes and funded by a textile manufacturing fortune, who at the end of his life had an hotel on the Rue de Magdebourg, housed spectacular architectural elements and works of art in his collection. You can see them here, left to right. So on the far left of the screen from the chapel of the Château of Pagny, a very, very important French Renaissance monument. But Fouque's activities are hardly documented. Other than that, we know he was collecting from the mid-1860s and had moved his collection to its new home by the mid-1880s, where its reputation grew. Though mysterious, unlike Gavet, Fouque didn't really sell works of art, although some pieces that he owned ended up in the Arconati Visconti collection. But perhaps the sense that he wasn't much of a dealer is kind of suggested by the rather messy composition of this interior. Now, while Fouque died in 1916, his heirs only decided to dispose of the collection in 1927 with its sale to Wildenstein and Company, who followed the by then well-established practice of commissioning an illustrated scholarly catalogue. Fiske Kimball, who was director of the then Pennsylvania Museum from 1925 until the 1950s, recognized its value and negotiated on and off with Felix Wildenstein from late 1928 until late 1929, and in contrast to the bargain $125,000 paid by Ringling to Duveen for the Gavet material, the PMA agreed to a punchier price of $1.1 million. But two-thirds of this was paid off, I'd say, by an effort that would make any development department of an American museum proud by May 1930, although the remainder burdened the museum for 20 years subsequently. Kimball told the story of the agreement to purchase the collection in an unpublished memoir in the museum archives entitled The Golden Age of American Collecting, which was made even more dramatic and bold by the fact that he said it took place on the very day the stock market crashed in the days following October the 24th, 1929, and the beginnings of the Great Depression. And it's interesting to note, though, that Kimball, for all this audacity, was also following the fate of the Albert Figdor collection in Vienna as an alternative because of its certain similarities to the Fouque collection. And it just worked out that Fouque happened the way it did. But without question, the Fouque collection was worth the considerable pain because it allowed Kimball at a stroke to raise immeasurably the level of the museum's holdings of Renaissance decorative arts and to build in some of the architectural elements into his much-discussed walk through time, this series of ostensibly authentic period room interiors from Asia, India, Europe, and America are drawn together, to which one could see the works of art made in those times for, in theory, those interiors, as problematic as that may be. But it's really important to note that the rooms were already actively being acquired and put together before the Fouque collection happened. It's not that the second-floor galleries of the museum were shaped around the Fouque collection. It didn't work that way. And in fact, in terms of... I should say that in terms of putting these galleries together, Kimball was actually buying architectural elements from various people, including George Gray Barnard, Paul Gouvert, and others. And in the installation of the museum galleries in spring 1931, we see on the left-hand side, he borrowed objects from the Pitcairn family, from Barnard, and also the dealer Brummer. And on the right, I'm just showing you, for fun, something that Fulk had purchased from the Gavet sale of 1897. It's a Virgin Child by Giovanni Antonio Amadeo that goes with the two figures of clerics in the collection here from an ark of the Persian martyrs in Cremona. At the time of the gallery installation, one object that was judged a key medieval, if you will, work was this item, pictured from the Fulk catalogue. This was known as the Lit de Justice d'Argenteuil, an elaborately carved, traceried, canopied, and enclosed structure with, as you can see, I think, fleur-de-lis on the back panel there on the left back, carved figures on these pendentives of the canopy, and this kind of branch and blind tracery on the back wall. In the museum's official puff celebrating the purchase of, quote, one of the most important monuments of Gothic woodcarving which has been preserved, unquote, the piece was explicitly described as a dais from which a nobleman would have pronounced his judgment, so this kind of ceremonial canopy under which a nobleman or indeed the king would sit in judgment. So the notion that this testament to the age of chivalry had fulfilled this purpose was not an invention born from the enthusiasms of Kimball. In fact, the suggestion can be traced back to an earlier moment, at the 1840s, when disassembled parts of the object were reputedly discovered in the attic of the 15th century manor of Argenteuil in Lower Normandy, near Argenton. And that's the manor on the left, and on the right I'm just showing you an evocative image of disassembled bits of stuff from Oviedo. Anyway, you get the idea. So an antiquarian, Léon de la Sicotière, related the discovery in an 1845 publication, Département de l'Orne, Archéologique et Pittoresque, and another periodical in 1847, which was accompanied by a lithograph. La Sicotière described the qualities of the carving in detail, concentrating on the pendentive figures, praising them for their genre-like interest. He described kind of kings, musicians, and peasants, and the chiselling of the wood as if it had been somehow vigorously modelled in clay rather than carved. This idea, I think, of the honest Gothic chisel. Significantly, the author mentions that the object was called at this time the Lit de Justice, although he didn't know for whom it was made. And furthermore, he reveals that the image presented with this text is actually a reconstruction of what the object would resemble once all its elements were assembled. So what we're seeing here in this drawing is the invention of a discrete ancient object on the page. Now, later generations of enthusiasts took the ideas of Sicotière and ran with them effectively, particularly the Comte de Meunier de Buisson, who was president of the local archaeological society, who wanted to raise funds to repair, as you can see, the rather damaged manor house. This author recounted the legend of a fairy at Argenteuil, seen here in a rare public appearance. Actually, it's his sister. She may have been a fairy too. We're also regaled by the tale of two ghosts in the manor, particularly the fearsome shade of a corrupt judge who menaces the great room on the first floor where the Lee had been installed. And further wild articles appeared under the auspices of the society, claiming it was somehow connected to King Louis XI, for example. And on the other hand, though, the society publications did give a 19th century provenance that's somewhat more reliable, or seems to be, and relates that upon inheriting the manor of Argenteuil in 1841, the Comte and Comtesse de Charnois discovered the Lyon residence, then moved it to another structure, and in 1877 employed a cabinet maker called Moreau to repair it. Now, inherited by the Vicomte de Courtivant around 1880, this well-travelled work of art was then shown apparently at the Palais de l'Industrie. I can't work out exactly which circumstances, but at which this photograph on the left was apparently taken. And so it was in the context of an exhibition. I suppose we could consider that a vehicle for educating the public and invested amateur, where they could admire some of the sculpted figures. In this case, on the left, a traveller, and on the right, a penned flock of sheep that was described in the 1840s as a nest of mice. Wasn't looking too carefully. But around this moment, Fulk purchased the object, and while we don't know how this was negotiated or what he paid, it does seem that the work was adapted slightly, because if you recall the early images of his collection in situ, and I'll show more, he shortened the height of the back wall on the left and added more refined linen fold panelling beneath the carved back panel on the lower right. While it was on display, the historian collector Edmond Bonafé had seen the structure and added his opinion in his own book, Le Meuble en France au XVIe siècle. But he defined the object as an alcove for a bed rather than as a dais. But even then, these kind of published references obviously add to the prestige of such objects. And, in claiming that this was a canopy for solemn ritual, I assume that the Lit de Justice partisans were somehow influenced by notions of historical practices, whether this was taken from troubadour kind of literary sources or histories of medieval France. It's something I need to look into further. I'm exploring this, if you'd like, through Jean Fouquet's elimination of 1458 for a translation of Boccaccio's Fates of Famous Men and Women, representing Charles VII in this role. The idea of it being a bed alcove, again, comes from something, again, that's kind of relatable, I suppose, the idea of a bed with a fixed baldachin, an object of prestige in wealthy households, which I'm representing here with actually quite, I think, a problematic object, a canopied bed discovered in the late 19th century from the Château of Villeneuve-Lambron in the Auvergne and renovated in the early 16th century for someone called Rigaud d'Oreille. And it's part of a well-known ensemble of pieces that was given by Émile Père to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in the 1890s, and it's heavily restored. And I think maybe the pole on the right-hand side is the original part of the bed. I'm not quite sure, but I think it's a strange thing. We need to talk about that. It may also be, and I'm afraid I left this slide at the end, that Viollet-le-Duc's Dictionnaire raisonné de mobilier français of 1858 may have been influential, and I'll try and get to that image at the end. Anyway, these beds, invented and real-ish, are exceptional in the majority of beds or bed structures, and clearly something of such status as a lit de justice would convey magnificence and social status through the display of textiles. And, our so-called lit de justice obviously doesn't really fit that possibility. And the uncertainties around this object, I think, are suggested by the early installation views of the object in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where we see on the left the temporary display of Fulk objects in 1929 at Memorial Hall, where you see that the panelled wall with the fleur-de-lis is separated on the right-hand side. There's furniture hanging on it. Shouldn't do that. And then sort of in the centre of the room, the canopy with the dais is placed there. And then in 1930, on the right-hand side, slightly later on, where we see it as a kind of fully functioning collector's alcove, dropped right out of Gavet's apartment. And that's kind of a strategy that Fisk-Kimball used to raise money for people to pay off our massive debt for the Fulk collection. Worked. From 1931 onwards, we see the dais and canopy accessorised with a curule chair, an appropriate seat for an official sitting in judgment, and a scaled-back installation of more recent times on the right. What then to make of the assorted and finely carved microarchitecture of these open-work tracery panels, cresting and pinnacles? Well, it's pretty clear that the elements making up the object don't belong to each other in the sense of completing a genuine piece of secular furniture. I'm sure you've all realised this. While exact stylistic analysis of the carvings is beyond the scope of this talk, I just wanted to show you the canopied mid-16th century choir at the Cathedral of Auch, which suggests, I think, this form of the canopy, although the canopy itself has been kind of pulled apart into all of its constituent parts. There's no structural material, so we're not really sure quite how it worked. While the officiant's chair and back panels from the chapel of the College of Picard of around 1500 in Paris on the right evokes, I think, the possible relationship between integrated carved panels and seating furniture, which may be an origin for the back panel. In some respects, the rather wild and absolutely secular figures on the pendentives in this slide. You'd note the chap in the left-hand slide. He's a very avant-garde musician, I would say. Help us to understand why this aggregation of elements was interpreted as coming from a worldly, albeit noble, context. However, their content is comparable to the genre interests apparent in the misericords, the folding seats of choir stalls, such as those at Rouen Cathedral from the late 15th century. So at the top there's a man near a well and a man playing a bagpipe in the conventional way, though of a different level of quality, thank God. Anyway, what seems uncommon is the appearance of these mischievous figures on the visible canopy within a sacred space rather than the underside of a seat that would be covered by the behind of a member of the clerical elite. I mean, that's how misericords worked. So, I'm still thinking this through. If these images and canopy held from an ecclesiastical context, are they a kind of representation of broad human activity placed in relation to their creator and judgment by their place in the sanctuary. I don't know, but that's something to think on. While the back panel is explicitly religious in content, it shows the tree of Jesse, in fact, or a fragment of it. And I don't know if you may be able to see it in this image. Towards the top, there's the figure of the Virgin and Child, and beneath there would have been the figure of Jesse, which is now lost. The courtly women on the sides advance forward from the branches are presumably sibyls. They might have met the arms of a wide seat. But in the context of the interpretation of this panel in the 19th and early 20th century references, it's very interesting that the discussion of the iconography of the Jesse panel is really just avoided. They just don't talk about it. I'm going to jog on here. But in thinking about, I want to think a little bit about trends. And one could consider these kind of Gothic traceries, figures, and foliate carvings of the branches as fulfilling a kind of category of medieval pieces of furniture that could be placed within a collected group of pieces revealing change over time, or, as we've seen, employed as a means by which to recreate an authentic period atmosphere. So this was the fate on the left-hand side of a canopied chair with tracery, and on the right-hand side with a dresser with deeply carved foliate ornament, purchased from the Spitzer sale, again in 1893. But the seat was bought by Jacques Siegfried for his restoration of the Chateau of Langeais. And the idea there was in Langeais is to evoke the context of the chateau in 1491, an important moment in its history, whereas the dresser was bought for the by the Marquise Arconati Visconti, who donated several pieces of furniture to the Louvre, I think sort of demonstrating the developments in French furniture over the 16th century. And Agnès tells me that, I don't know about the authenticity of the canopy at Langeais, but the dresser on the right, Agnès tells me, has been studied and seems to be a rarely or really very complete authentic object of the late 15th century, early 16th century. Moving back to America for a moment, something I think that may underline the continuing perceived historical and commercial value of early furniture in the 1920s is the acquisition by William Millikan for the Cleveland Museum of Art of this abbot's throne, again probably of the early 16th century, and perhaps from northern France, with a back panel showing the tree of Jesse. The importance of integrating this impressive architecturally complex object within Cleveland's growing collections of medieval art could perhaps be demonstrated by the price of $35,000 paid to Arnold Seligman. I'm not sure how that compares, say, with other things, but it seems quite expensive. And interesting here in that, I think, frankly, the object's something of a curator's egg in that the throne, to me, seems right, whereas the linfold panelling seem to me as if they've been associated. And I'm very grateful to Stephen Flegel for allowing me to look at the object only the other day, really. But in thinking about this, this object does hint at the appreciation by curators and collectors of historic furniture. So that when we see Ringling's early installation of the Gavet collection, it seems that he valued the juxtaposition of French furniture, as examples of French art from the 16th century, with Italian painting and sculpture, German painting and sculpture, as a whole picture. I don't really have enough images of furniture in the Fulk collection to show you, why I think Fulk was trying to create a complete picture. But I just want to draw your attention to the dresser in the centre there. In theory, in kind of an early 16th century style, this kind of transition, if you like, in French art from a flamboyant Gothic to early Renaissance. And on the right-hand side, this is of a later Burgundian cabinet of the late 16th century. Fulk had one of those too. I don't want to get into specifics with these objects because it will take me too long. But, I get the sense that Fulk was trying to sort of represent a chronology. Oh, and here's the Viollet-le-Duc image that I wanted to show you earlier, just giving a size idea of a canopy bed, and I think that was influential in Bonifay's interpretation of our object. Ultimately, as we've discussed, we would associate the concept of presenting the development of French furniture to de Sommerard. And the furniture is a powerful presence in the lithographs showing the interiors of his museum. He also was not immune to the kind of assemblage approach to objects, demonstrated with the dresser on the right, said to be from the Church of Saint-Paul de Lyon, and was supposed to be a kind of container for church treasures, but it's really made of diverse bits, fragments. And for Fulk, one can imagine the satisfying collection strategy of pulling together a representative grouping of woodwork from a late medieval period to the late Renaissance, especially given this kind of exceptional quality of a lit de justice, even though we know now it's problematic, and this is how we display it in the museum. we call it fragments from a canopy and choir stall, rightly. But, Fulk was described as one of the greatest amateurs of Renaissance woodwork. And it's interesting to me that his apartment was in the same area of Paris as the Palais du Trocadero, the home of the Musée de Sculpture Comparée, this encyclopedic museum of Gothic, or rather of medieval sculpture. And I don't know that I can make the great claim that Fulk was an encyclopedic collector of furniture, but it's fun to me to kind of think of him or think of collectors in those terms. Clearly the picture is much more complex. What I wonder also in thinking about the life of this museum object is to what degree external factors motivated its audience to overlook its inconsistencies and to understand it as a great example of secular late Gothic furniture. That it was accepted perhaps demonstrates the strength of these influences to the extent that these people might as well have believed in fairies. Thank you.
Thank you. A series of really wonderful talks this morning. As you've no doubt noticed, we're already running a little bit late, and rather than interrupt the lunch and any breaks that we might have later, we have an extra discussion session built into the afternoon. So we're proposing to combine discussion and questions for the first two sessions till the afternoon, so that we can move on and get you enough time for lunch. I'm fascinated by the papers this morning, which I thought were all excellent. And it seems to me that we're witnessing in 19th century France, especially in the later part of the century and the early part of the 20th century, things in change, things in flux. Not only are we in the process of defining the Middle Ages, dividing it from the Renaissance and deciding what it actually means, conceiving the Middle Ages in terms of nationalism, especially in France, but almost more importantly, in terms of ethnicity. What does it mean to be French? And I think the influence of the role of anti-Semitism at a time of the Dreyfus trial is what particularly struck me. But also in flux at this moment is the role of the curator, and there are many curators in the audience, and it's very interesting to me how our own role seems to be going back in the 21st century to a lot of these mixed roles of advising dealers, advising collectors, displaying works of private art in the hopes that one might be given it, negotiating with large private collections for special favors. And we know that some museums are actually entering a very gray area of collaboration of this type. So we're witnessing the curator, a job that has to be invented. Is it a collector? Is it an advisor? Is it a scholar, an expert, a museum maker? Is it a decorator? All of the above. And sometimes, unfortunately, curators also become dealers, as we've heard today. And I think, finally, the role of the collector is uncertain. Is a dealer a collector? Is it a speculator? Sometimes they are. Are things being promised to museums and then being sold in the market? It's interesting to me that these things happened in the 1890s, just as, by the way, they happen in modern America. And I think this is also, an extremely instructive thing that we've learned today. Well, we'll move on to further issues of authenticity and decoration. Our next speaker comes to us from Waddesdon Manor. Please welcome Ulrich Leben.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So this is the touch.
Kate. Yes. This one. Okay, so which one? Section 2. And F5. F5. Is that where we are? Go to the next slide. Yes. There we are. All right. Space bar. Mm-hmm.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. After we had a very wonderful beginning of the morning, I'm coming back to an issue we talked about yesterday, which is the installation of the objects and what did they mean to the owners and how did they like to install them. And I'm going to talk about a wonderful and a very rare occasion of a National Trust house, which started off as a Rothschild house, which is Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, and where actually one of those Jewish tycoon collections has survived completely with the furniture and the curio cabinet and the smoking room, and is now of kind of worldwide value after the demolition and the dispersion of many of these, and especially the Jewish collections on the continent in Europe. So Waddesdon Manor today as the main home for a fantastic 18th century French furniture collection, which I have the pleasure to work with, but then also home of a smoking room, the so-called curio smoking room, which has stayed in place. So the site is the same, but which had an interesting adventure because the collection itself was given by the builder of the house to the British Museum, where it is still today. And we found ourselves confronted with the wish of recreating a smoking room with the curio collection, which was reinstated in the late 90s. But how did it all start? How did the Rothschilds actually like to live with these trophies of treasure art? And it's very interesting to see some contemporary documents. And I show you here the Great Hall at Mentmore, a house built by Paxton, carving in stone made by the Italian sculptor Monti, and the sheer amount of size and of tapestries and of value of objects give a kind of princely appearance, which is very much the aim of the Rothschild collectors at the time, which is kind of dwarfing the figures, and the scale is like that when you go to the house, which is actually in very poor state right now. The fireplace was said to come from Rubens' house in Antwerp, and the tapestries all from Belgium and from France, and the enormous lanterns would come from the Doge's gondola, the Bucephalus in Venice, and hing very effectful on the ceiling of that great hall. Now, Paxton built another house for the Rothschild branch in France, and here the idea of princely installation and of great value is still even enhanced with real accumulation of works of art of every gender, which are very well documented in this watercolor by Eugène Lamy, a museum kind of courtyard with a cenital lighting. And we see in other watercolors that actually the works of art and the treasure works, like from the Gauvet collection, they just mingle with the objects, so that actually the inhabitants of the place are living within the art collection. They are part of the whole layout, and it's not a museum and so on, but you're kind of living in a princely treasure trove, in a kind of Schatzkammer, as they were known from the past, which was tried to emulate at the time. Now, where did it all start? I couldn't not show you some amusing images from France and Germany, and so I was very curious in discovering in Blois Castle on the Loire River this little cabinet with wall paneling, and when you tip on a little hidden trap in the waistcoat, you can open doors which actually were used as a little curio cabinet where the precious objects were kept, or where precious objects were kept, which is actually very interesting because it's completely different as these Gauvet displays in these very flamboyant apartments as we saw them on the pictures during the last 2 days. Another very interesting curio display which has survived very happily is in the Gotha Castle in Thuringia in Germany, where these treasure objects are actually displayed in cabinets, in enormous wardrobes where you can see them in a way they have been mixed and mingled by the reigning family of the place for centuries. Now, this is the ancestry and the idea where it came from, the princely home, the collecting of curio, of precious objects and mixed objects, which can range from local archaeology to the Limoges enamel. Now, what happens in the 19th century is that the Rothschilds really create that incredible interest, which of course was also fostered by other trendsetters and tycoons or eccentrics, such as the Count Demidoff, the Wallace collection with Lord Hereford, the Rothschilds, and later the Duc d'Aumale. They all had an idea. They wanted to display these things, to show off their wealth and to show off their curiosity and their love for very precious objects. And thus we come to the point that we have these incredible remains of photographs of Rothschild houses, private houses in Paris, which could afford very lavish displays of their collections. And this is the collection of Salomon de Rothschild in Paris, in the Rue Berryer. And it just shows, again, a kind of private museum laid out with showcases, tables on which things are displayed. But it's a kind of museum where you can kind of enjoy privately your collection with furniture, objects of different kinds and of different materials, and also of textiles and tapestries. What is interesting is that with the love for objects in the Rothschild family, we know that they would find their objects on the art market. They would go to auctions internationally and had agents all over Europe. We know this from Ferdinand de Rothschild, who lived in England, but he bought extensively in Germany, German sales, and also in Paris. But he would also buy from families directly. So we have several deals which are concluded between Ferdinand de Rothschild and the Duke of Devonshire, and the Duke of Devonshire sold fake, so kind of, this is very difficult linguistic, subtle wording, how we say, but he bought objects which were thought to be completely authentic, and they are only partly authentic, as we know today. But it's very interesting to see that apparently the European collectors, and especially the Rothschilds, would actually go to search for things, and they would never go to buy en bloc. And that's, for me, very interesting, coming from the European background and still looking myself and looking and searching and how you find things. There's a very different attitude in America, like the American collector who goes to Gavet and buys the whole apartment or 1/3 of the apartment. That's kind of very different to the European approach. You can find that, and we find it later with Edmond de Rothschild, who buys an entire collection of drawings which were assembled in the beginning of the 19th century to accumulate, to introduce them into his already very extent collection. But for the objects, it's more used at that time that the collector goes and assembles his own collection by looking in all different places and then creating his own collection. Now, the love for the medieval could go very far in the Rothschild family, and I just show you an extreme image with this revival of the Gothic and Renaissance, and here again, it's just words which are used not precisely as to be interpreted in a way we want to use them today, but it's kind of an atmosphere which in the 19th century was mentioned more to describe a feeling than a precise period. But this is the Van Zielen Castle in Netherlands, built by a Rothschild heir, and here you see how far the Gothic feeling could go, to create this great Gothic hall, which is kind of spanning the whole 3 floors in the center of a building. The French branch of the family was more discreet, and the collection was more heading to the curio cabinet, as we saw in earlier pictures. And this is a detail of the private museum of Alphonse de Rothschild, where you especially see the different kinds of weapon, armory, furniture, and sculpture work, and then also ceramics and probably enamel, and very nicely put together in a kind of decorative way in order to be enjoyed by a private collector. A room which survived miraculously today with its cuir de Cordoue wall covers is the remains of the curio cabinet in the Hotel Salomon de Rothschild in Rue Berryer in Paris, which has kept some items of the collection. And again, here you have wall paneling, the leather wall covers, and then the cabinets before, and then they're very well dressed in this decorator style, symmetrically arranged as it was redone. I don't want to comment on the objects here and their authenticity. This is really another topic, but what is very interesting is the arrangement of that room, specially arranged. It's kind of a different room from the rest of the house, which is a very modern house. And here in the smoking room, curio cabinet, there is a special atmosphere and a kind of collector's atmosphere which is created by the special layout of the room, which is made to evocate a kind of retreat for study and for collecting. In Waddesdon, we have the unique case that the collection as it was in the time of Ferdinand de Rothschild when he built the house in the 1880s and 90s, the room was very well documented in a photographic book which he made for his friends and which was distributed on a private base. But what we see here is that the Rothschilds really again tried to live amongst the objects. So this room, which is the collector's room, was called the smoking room. It is still today the smoking room, and there is a fireplace which is functioning and which can be used with a very tamed gas fire. But we see that the mix of the cabinets and the furniture and the soft furnishings, which are definitely modern and they're made to be sat on and to be used, are really a particular and a special characteristic of the Rothschild attitude towards the living and the installation of their collections. Now, when Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild died in 1898, unexpectedly from a heart attack, he was only 60 years old and he was in full swing of still accumulating more art objects. In the last years of his life, he had been heavily buying things for the collection. So he had decided at the end of his life, at the later life, that he would like to give on his death this collection to the British Museum. And this is one of the biggest single-handed donations the British Museum got in the domain of Renaissance and medieval works of art. The collection was taken away from Waddesdon Manor and brought to the British Museum, where you can still see it today in a special space dedicated to it and called the Waddesdon Bequest. It has been catalogued very carefully by Hugh Tate, and it has stood the proof of time and the test of science. And there are many objects which are actually what we think they are, and less objects which are kind of forgeries or things which were added onto in order to make them desirable for the collector. But what is very interesting is that the room was left at an empty shell when Alice de Rothschild took over the house after the death of her brother. And it was only in the 90s that this room was refigured by the present Lord Rothschild, who's still the president of Waddesdon Manor as an administrator, and that the room was put back together with now things which were coming from the family and from the National Trust collection, but it was possible to reinstate the room very much so as Baron Ferdinand had known, especially as all the fixings in the room, as the fireplace and the soft furnishings, have survived in situ. So what is very typical for the Rothschildish layout of the room is the red damask at the wall, the deep button sitting furniture, and the lead glass in the windows, which are actually no longer given into a courtyard, but actually artificially lit in the background. We have the window side with the Victorian draperies and the sculptures standing in the windows. And we have reinstated a showcase which was acquired on the flea market in Paris from an old museum and reinstated with a precious object collection and a Majolica plate collection which belonged to Alice de Rothschild, because when she found herself with an empty space, which was the space of obviously of the smoking room, of which the contents hadn't been moved to the British Museum, she started to collect again. And so it was possible to reunite all these wonderful things today to recreate the smoking room in Waddesdon in its decoration. Now, when we look at the pictures from the 1898 book, just in the year of Ferdinand de Rothschild, when he died, we see that the furniture in the room is looking in style like the showcase there, but obviously was made on purpose perhaps from old elements. Also very interesting is that Alice de Rothschild, after the donation of the collection to the British Museum, had to restart a weapon collection. And the layout of the weapon collection within the armory corridor was made by her and is still in place as she installed it, and apparently based on old or on historic armory layouts, as I show on a picture in a house in northern England, in a castle which kind of was the model. It's interesting that she got advice for collecting armory by Sir Laking, who was the advisor for armory at the royal household, but that in fact we have some of these objects which are actually not right. So again, even Sir Laking was not very sure in what he did, and as much as we have gems in this armory collection, there are several things which prove to be more like theater weapons than anything else. Now, within the collection, there are some prime pieces, and I just want to show the fireplace shelf, which has been very modernly installed with fiber optic lighting, and the glass shelves. But there are treasures such as the basil ball, which is a Hispano-Moresque basil ball that was inherited by a present member of the family from the French branch, and actually comes from James de Rothschild's collection in Paris. It's a unique piece, and there's only one equivalent in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. So that's just to give some highlight of the objects in the collection. The glass is one of the other highlights in the collection, which is wonderful Neapolitan glass from the 17th and 18th century. Now, the layout of the room is also very interesting because the furniture, which you see in the photographs in the black and white on the left-hand screen, is still there. And we know that it was the firm of Decour, a decorator firm of Decour. They made a lot of furniture. They also made furniture for the Cahen d'Anvers family and the Nissim de Camondo family. The Decour family still exists. The business still exists, but they're very discreet, and it's very difficult to get access to their archives, not to say non-access, because they don't want people to know for whom they worked, etc. The stained glass windows are modern, so to say, end of the 19th century. They are still in situ, and the door is very interesting because part of the door frame and of the fillings of the door panels might be historic, but the time here is too short to kind of go into detail. It would be much more fun to do this one day. You come to Waddesdon and we really look together and investigate what we're doing a lot. A wonderful case in Waddesdon is that even the very fragile soft furnishings, such as these portfolio stands in this kind of fringe and tassel look and passementerie, have survived. They were made partly from historic fabrics, and we still keep these things. This is a special thing of the Waddesdon collection, that even these kind of ephemeral have stayed the test of time. Now, Waddesdon has a small collection of stained glass, which is set into windows in a corridor. And I just show you, of course, we know all that Walpole had wonderful collection of stained glass in Strawberry Hill. And I show on the left watercolor, in the watercolor on the left, a stained glass window in the Castle of Berlin, because it's just very evocative of the taste for several things which were kind of liked by people at the time. The Rothschilds set examples, and just as a small excursus, I need to talk about the case of the Empress Victoria. Empress Victoria was a friend of Ferdinand de Rothschild, and she inherited a complete collection of curious objects by Robert Tornoff. Robert Tornoff was an obscure Berlin collector from the 19th century. He had his collection published and had it displayed in the way you see on the left-hand screen. Now, Victoria built her own mansion, and she displayed it in a Rothschild style while living with the things. So she had a big drawing room with cabinet, as Parisian collectors had, and she had a dining room with a showcase for ceramics, as you see on the upper screen, which is very interesting how a collector and then another collector display things in Europe at that time. The publication of the collections was a very strong issue for the Rothschilds, either being published as in the Red Book, which is the red volume there for his friends to show objects and to show the layout of the house, or to show the donations as were done with the collection of Waddesdon, the Waddesdon Bequest by the British Museum, first publication being out in the early 1900s. But there are more examples of Alphonse de Rothschild's collection for the Louvre, which was also published in volumes which were highly illustrated and very lavishly published in France at the same time. Just the Waddesdon Bequest title page with the front page with the picture of Ferdinand de Rothschild. So the publication was a clause for the bequest, and the research on the collection was very important for Ferdinand de Rothschild, thus to establish this as a real standing collection. And apparently also there was the great fear that once he would be dead, that this collection and all the contents of the house would be kind of spread and sold all over the world. And so he was very happy to be able to be, as a trustee of the British Museum, to leave his collection, and that collection, which was very precious to him, to a national museum where it is still today and where it has really stood the test of time. Objects are wonderful to be seen, as this Majolica vase with mounts which were made in Paris in the neoclassical period, and you can just see them in the alcove of the smoking room in the background, standing on these high columns. And it's really wonderful to see the colors of them when you go to the British Museum and see them in reality. The curio room at the dairy was another thing, which was a collector's kind of cabinet, but with really curiosities, as well as Meissen monumental animals, as sleighs or Renaissance chairs, and beer jugs from Germany. That's another side of this collecting of old artifacts, but in a less academic way than was aimed for in the smoking room at Waddesdon. And just to conclude is the idea that the Rothschilds really lived with the arts. They wanted to be representative, they wanted to show off these things, but in a way, social life played and they lived their social life within this collection, just as the princely collections they wanted to emulate. And the remains of the collection at Waddesdon just give a very good insight of the incredible wealth and the care which was taken to applicate the collections in the decoration and the layout. And as the last image, I just show you the frames covered with 17th century textiles, which were used. The textiles were used for doing a mirror frame, and you can just gather them on the right in the middle picture on the black and white, and that gives you an idea how the idea of decorating, about which Paul Miller will talk to us later also, and laying out the collection, is also a very important fact in the collecting of the Rothschilds. Now, to finish off, we have heard several times about the French anti-Semitism, which is very interesting. Of course, the Rothschilds were new money, but what is very often forgotten also in the press is that apart from socializing, and this is the staircase Ferrières, there was the philanthropic side. And while constructing his castle in Waddesdon, Ferdinand Rothschild was also restoring the almshouses to provide housing for poor people in the village. The village was completely reconstructed, got water supply, electric supply, and all kind of modernity, which was unheard of before in Buckinghamshire. And it's very interesting that through the care of Ferdinand and the kind of layout of his house, still today you have a room and a whole collection of European artifacts which has stayed in a way which is rather unique on a European stand for the accumulation over 5 generations of Rothschild collecting, which has accumulated things from all over Europe, and which, thanks to the fact that the National Trust takes care and we have the presidency of the family, is still there to be enjoyed by everybody today, and is hopefully still there for a very long time. Thank you very much for your amable attention.
I'm going to call my colleagues up, Maureen and Virginia, and we have a small change in schedule. Because we have a cancellation this afternoon, one of the speakers couldn't make it from New York. Paul Miller has graciously consented to start after lunch, which gives us now a little bit of time for questions and gets us to lunch all on time so you can enjoy the exhibition and other things during our break. So I'm wondering if the audience has any questions for this morning's speakers. We've seen a vast and very interesting array of material, all closely related. I mean, if people had shared their papers, I don't think you could have had more overlapping topics. I think especially the issue of authenticity has come up in a very nice way. Each of the speakers has talked about the nature of authenticity, whether collectors were looking at genuine works of art, were buying works of art that could be used in decorative formats to complete the interiors of rooms, and whether this might be accomplished through restoration, through copies, through 19th century emulations of the past. I think all of the speakers have dealt with that in a very interesting and intelligent way. But questions from the audience here in the front.
Monet was a proponent of the improvement of objects for being displayed in decorative objects in private settings, right? Or in collectors' rooms. So do you think there was in what Monet said or wrote or the way he acted, and I think this is a question for you, an hierarchy for objects that they considered for the private collectors and to be displayed in private context, and for the objects that were eventually going to go to museums, or that they were seen as museum objects? I mean, was there in the acceptance of improvement, hierarchy between private and public objects, or not?
Well, I think the point I was trying to make at the end was really specifically that Molinier's book, the book that I showed you, was really aimed not so much at collectors, it was aimed at manufacturers, and was saying, look, if you look at works made in the past, we've improved the design of modern objects. And that's something that all other museums and other museum curators, like particularly the V&A, that's why the V&A was set up, to do exactly the same thing. So that's obviously a Europe-wide phenomenon. In the case of Molinier, I don't know of any evidence that shows him saying, well, this is a better work, this should be in a museum, and this is maybe not so good, so this should be with a collector. I know of no evidence for that. In the case of one expert, Wilhelm von Bode, I do know that among his correspondence, there are kind of suggestions that he knew that works that had been bought by friends of his were perhaps not quite as good as those collectors thought that they were, but that he hadn't told them. And this is discussed by Jeremy Warren in a great article. Yeah. Other than that, I'm not really sure what to say. I don't know if you've got
Can I follow up? Because I think this idea of hierarchy and different standards for different situations is extremely important, and several of the speakers alluded to this. I want to ask a follow-up then to Agnès, and you have to stand up and face the audience, or you come up and use the microphone. But is there a different standard, for example, for furniture? Is furniture treated in a different way in terms of authenticity, forgery, repair, restoration than, for example, 15th century or 14th century paintings or sculpture? Is there already a feeling that certain things were more deserving of intense scrutiny, and that somehow furniture and other decorative arts are a little lower and more restoration and more repair could be accepted? Do you want to come here and use this? You have a nice soft voice.
Well, for the furniture, mostly he has a very genuine vision of the furniture, and he thinks that it's authentic furniture. But what is interesting that, for example, for the dresser that Jack showed, so the dresser in the Louvre, It comes from the Spiters collection. And Molinier, in the Spiters catalogue, says that it's partly remade. And in fact, it's, well, for me, it's completely authentic. So I guess it's just that at this moment, Molinier and, for example, Bonafé don't have the same vision as we have. So, I mean, it's not, well, I'm sorry, it's hard to say in English, but I mean, it's not that they are not good at criticizing the furniture. It's just that they don't have the skills for that. Yeah, that we have today.
That has tiny pieces in repairs that were made to the object, and then it was coated with what seems to be kind of like a Divine butter when it was Divine, and that made the object extremely consistent. And then what happens to this object goes to Terence Mackey's collection in the 1930s, and Wilhelm Valentino looked at it and decided it's a fake because it's so consistent. But now, because the repairs are less obvious, we were able to kind of pull it apart and say, well, no, actually, it's a real object, and it's just that it happens. It comes up and down over time. So, I mean, thinking about you have to think about what they were looking at then, and I think something they were marked as well. And again, they just had different expectations.
Here. Maybe our first speaker, do you want to tackle this question? Or Glenn, you talked a little bit about this.
I can give you one example from the V&A's collections. I mean, I don't know of the fabrication of provenance as being a standard thing at all. Usually what you got was a kind of, said to have come from, or might have been here. There was a kind of an oral history attached to objects, but that's not really the same thing. In the V&A, we do have one object, though, which is, it's a 12th century, we always described it as a reliquary. It was known as the Eltenberg reliquary. And this object was supposed to have come from a monastery at Hoch Elten, and there was a whole story about how it had been at this nunnery that was sort of supplied at the time that we acquired it. When we came to conserve it for our new medieval and Renaissance galleries, because we were concerned about how authentic it was, we were very happy to discover that it's almost entirely authentic, and the restoration work is the really obvious stuff that we already knew about. But we discovered hidden inside a sheet of paper which said that it had come from the monastery of Saint Pantaleon in Cologne, which is quite a convincing argument, just because the object itself was probably made in Cologne. So this was entirely new to us, and it's now led us to think that this whole story of it having come from Hoch Elten was just really part of the sales pitch when it was sold to the V&A. Now, whether that was consciously created or whether somebody just casually mentioned, we think this might have been the case, and that snowballed into a more long-winded story. I mean, who knows?
Okay, so I have a question. I hope maybe Aurélie can address it, or possibly Ulrich. Although I think it comes up with everybody, with everything that everybody's been talking about this morning. Is how does this, especially in the 19th century in France, how do these developments and this looking at medieval art, looking at Renaissance art, how does this and the formation of museums, but also private collections, how does this relate to sort of the evolution of French national identity? So, issues of French nationalism in that period, which is obviously the century after the French Revolution. How does this do these developments in collecting and museum formation and the taste for display and all that, does this relate in any way to sort of political developments, or where is the chicken, where is the egg? Do these contribute? Does anyone want to come and?
Coming from the Rothschild background, the Rothschilds were coming from Frankfurt, but they send different branches out to all over Europe. And we have Naples, Frankfurt, London, Paris. And it's very interesting, and Vienna, and it's very interesting, for example, with Ferdinand, he was born physically in Paris, brought up in Frankfurt and Vienna, but he moved to England because his mother was English and he loved England. So there you have somebody who speaks 4 languages, who has been living in 4 different capitals of Europe. And the issue is for this Jewish tycoon family not as much a national thing. I think the national thing is really the antithesis. This is this kind of thing which Agnes has spoken about. This is this kind of anti-mondialization. It's like today, in a way. We're living, we're coming back because mondialization is coming too close. But I think some family like the Rothschild family, they were just acting with their means. I mean, Frankfurt, we have descriptions of Ferdinand Rothschild describing his father packing the silver cups when they went on the summer cottage holiday because he wanted to have his collection with him. And so the son just picks up and he does the same thing, and he has an international network of agents, and the cousins correspond. There is this and this, you can buy that, and this one has that thing for sale. And I think it was a very, very international field. And when you go in and you look in collections, we have heard the names of Bode and of other dealers who were working at the same time, and they were working for catering an international audience. So I think that the idea of nationalism is much more our problem today, because we think like, oh, this is America and this is Europe. Because I think at the time, in a certain social milieu, there was already a great internationalization, or a kind of international community where they were speaking, and everybody was speaking 2 or 3 languages, or at least in the Rothschild field and in this Jewish tycoon area, they were speaking several languages. Okay, so it's that kind of feeling. Yes?
I'm sorry. We with the rain, we need to make some accommodations. We have trams ready to take anyone who's going to Treviso for lunch. If you go to the lobby of the education building, the trams will be waiting for you. Dr. Brilliant, students, your lunch is served upstairs in room 2300. And Symposius, we are inviting you to join us for lunch upstairs in the director's conference room, and there is staff who can direct you there. We'll be back here at 1 o'clock to reconvene. Thank you.